it was an oral tradition first. And you can tell when a poem was written only on the page and then it's arriving to air for the first time. And it's like, I don't know how to
Oh
walk.
my
I don't know
goodness.
how to do
I just
here.
had a whole, oh, if you could have heard me in the car. It's becoming so clear to me, especially recently, how
Mm,
much poets, especially folks who like only go through the MFA or things like that, how deeply
mhm.
we need a class on poetry in the oral tradition. I'm like, I need a class where you're forced to recite a poem. Hello, poets of the internet. I'm Diesel Carson, and this is O Word, the podcast interested in craft, poets, their obsessions, and the things that keep them writing. Today's episode is O Prosody. I'm here today with my friend Tariq Thompson. Tariq Thompson is a poet and educator from Memphis, Tennessee. He is the author of the chapbook Lone Lily from Sunset Press 2021. His poetry has appeared in the American Poetry Review, the Adroit Journal, Split Lip Magazine, and elsewhere. Thompson was a finalist for the 2023 Ruth Lilly and Dorothy Sargent Rosenberg Fellowship. He holds an MFA in poetry from New York University. You can find more of his work at tariqthompson.com. Tariq, hello.
Hello.
How is
How
your
are you?
good? How's your day going?
It's going all right. I ate good this morning. The daylight savings time definitely whipped my ass though. So a little sleepy.
Yes, as we talk on this daylight savings day, I have just returned from AWP, which, if anyone here is
Mm.
a usual listener, I might sound a little slower than usual, is because I am rebooting from
Mm.
a long and beautiful AWP conference. We got to throw ass in Lucille Clifton's home.
I saw.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely a kind of a spiritual experience. Like we were in her
Mhm.
home. Her daughter Sydney, who is just like this gorgeous being, was doing a little welcome for us. And at the
Mm.
end of the welcome, she started reciting "Won't You Celebrate with Me?" And
Mm.
all of the poets in the room, with the majority black room, started reciting the poem with her. And we all
Mm.
did those final lines together. And it was just like, wow, this is what it's all about. Like the community that's being created in this room, it's what it's all about. And
Oh, that's
then a
beautiful.
couple people walked into the room who did not look just like us and asked whose house it was. And that kind of broke the immersion. But nonetheless, it was a beautiful time, a tiring
Mm.
time, but now I'm back and super excited to be talking to you. You are one of my favorite poets. I think you know this, but I love telling you anyway. I just love everything that you do with language. I love your attention to sound and rhythm and just like movement. I'm really excited to talk to you about all those things today. But, this being a word, we love this being kind of a craft teaching podcast and this episode being about prosody. I would love if you can tell us in your own words what prosody is.
Yeah. And thank you also for having me on the podcast. I really appreciate it. And we get to speak all the time more casually. So it's really nice to be able to talk about poems and I guess share with other folks. So I consider prosody as a poem's dance throughout the body.
Poems dance. Say more about that dance, or how do you interpret that dance when you go about
Mhm.
writing?
Yeah. I was thinking about this earlier today. I think about poems as a kind of physics. I teach this to my students as well that like instead of thinking of a poem as bad or good, I invite them to consider a poem as strong or weak and that they are like physical forces in the world. So when I say that I've read one of your poems, right, Diesel, and I've been moved, I really mean that I started in one place, arrived to the poem in one like emotional state. And by the end of the poem, I'm somewhere on the other side of the room emotionally. And I assume for myself that I danced there if it was a really strong poem. I think about muscularity. I know we've talked a bit about a Carl Phillips essay related to that, but how a poem kind of feels in the mouth and the body, the surprises within that. And I think after reading a poem, also the quiet that comes afterwards. Like if a poem is really, really moving in a way that stays with me, I miss it after I finish the poem.
Yeah.
Does that make
It
sense?
does. It does. And I'm definitely going to come back to that Carl Phillips essay because I know that's one that's important to you. I love what you're saying there about the physics of it. And even strong and weak being distinct from good and bad. And how can maybe even a good poem be maybe a less strong poem? And what are the different ways that we quantify that or measure that? I also love what you're saying here about the soundscape, like the idea of quiet and how quiet fills a room. And I think especially with poets who play with sound and the relation between language and the mouth and things like that, the silence becomes
Mm-hmm.
its own actor. And that, especially, I know you're someone who thinks about and appreciates hip hop as an art
Mm-hmm.
form. So thinking about the way that space happens within one's quote unquote flow, how does that become a part of the line? As someone who appreciates hip hop, I would love to hear more about how you see that influencing your work as a writer.
Word, thank you. Yeah, hip hop, I mean, I love it. Oftentimes I wish that I was a rapper, maybe a successful rapper, but alas, I'm a poet, which is just as good. Um, I'm a very musical person. Folks that know me or have lived with me as you have can attest to all the times that I'm humming or freestyling or just singing whatever as I'm doing things. What's coming up to mind right now actually is when I was younger, I would go over my cousin's house while my mom worked, and um, we would have to do the dishes, my younger cousin and I,
Hmm.
and it was always a slog. And we're like, oh, we don't want to do the dishes. And so we started memorizing Maya Angelou's I Know What a Cage Bird Sings
Mm.
and singing it to one another as we washed the dishes. So I would do one verse and he would do the other. And even still, like to this day, I think I can still do it. The cage bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown but longed for still. We just be scrubbing away, singing the poems to one another. So, in terms of music generally, that's, I think, how important it is to me. And with hip hop, it just feels like magic. I'm continually impressed by the way that rappers are able to wield language both in a way that is sonically pleasing, or even if it's not sonically pleasing, just sonically moving, I'll say. The reason I said even if it's not sonically pleasing is I was thinking about Kendrick Lamar's You.
Hmm.
That's a very difficult listen.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorite songs by him, but there's a cacophony in there that makes it difficult to listen to on top of the subject matter. There are ways that a poem or a song can go against the grain of what we think is conventionally sonically pleasing and still have a profound effect or still communicate what the rapper or the poet intends. The reading of a poem is really important to me and is, I guess, in some senses, the most important part, I think. At least that's where I derive the most pleasure from poetry, the reading of it and the listening of it. I'm thinking of poets like Kaveh Akbar, who rocks on
Right.
the balls of his feet as he reads. Another example of the poem dancing through the body, like he cannot help it. It is right coming up through his feet. Um, I really do appreciate when poets have considered what a poem is like when it's living in air,
Yeah.
right?
I need a class where you're forced to go to a slam. Like, I need a poem. I need a class where you're forced to get judged by strangers on how you deliver. Because it's
Mhm,
obvious to me you didn't write this with someone intending it to read it out loud. It looks great on the
mhm,
page, terrific, beautiful on the page. But when it gets out into the air, it dies. If we're thinking about
mhm,
even like thinking about the poems as a conservatory for words, at some point we have to let those words go and live in the world. If those words are let out into the wild and they get into the world and they die, then we have not
mhm,
done our jobs as good
mhm,
conservationists of language. And so thinking about like how do we nurture those words, every syllable matters, especially in rapping, right? Hip hop. That's what
mhm.
makes it so. If we want to talk about like true inheritors of poetic tradition, in no place does iambic pentameter or anything otherwise matter than 16 bars. If you
Right,
fuck up the flow, people are gonna let you
yeah,
know. There's something really deeply connected to like tradition in the hip hop verse. Growing up in listening to hip hop, I think also imbues a certain kind of confidence in one's
Mm,
ability to, and I say the same thing about
mhm,
like growing up and doing slam, like it imbues a certain kind of confidence in the work because if you don't, that's what your peers have. And so if you want to measure up to your peers, even the people that you love, like you gotta have to take on, even if you don't feel it sometimes, you gotta put on a persona of confidence. I also love hearing what you're saying about you and your cousin and how the cage bird sings, and maybe that act of recitation. I'm wondering if that act of reciting a poem, you feel like has something that like has gone on even as you go on to do your own work, that the poem living in your head and then becoming some sort of music. Does that something that like resonates with you with your other writing?
it does. A lot of times a line will, and I think this is true of a lot of poets, right? A line will come into my head, and at times it feels like not magic's not the right word, but like a bird suddenly appearing in your mind, and it's there. And the bird has music, and you're like, I gotta get this bird on the page somehow. And then it moves on from there. I think that having experienced poems living within me definitely has made it, I would say, I won't say easier
Mm.
to be a poet, but more fruitful. I feel like I'm being truer to myself and to the language.
Thinking more about this music and this idea of sound in your writing process, what order of power would you say that sound lives in? Like how does it govern your approach to poetry? Like how important is it to you in all the things that you considering when you're crafting a poem?
I would say that sound reigns supreme, and sometimes that's to my detriment.
Interesting.
There have been many times where I have dug a hole for myself because I was really following the sound. It
Mm,
wasn't until revision later that I was able to excavate more of the meaning that needed to be there.
mhm,
But I always, I think, lead with sound because it just feels most natural and most exciting for me.
mhm,
A lot of times I'll begin with a free write, for example, and it'll be based on this kind of like associative sound play. So,
mhm,
for example, and I'll try and write just without really thinking too much and just like listening. And so a lot of my free writes, if you look at it, the first part of it, it doesn't make any sense because it's just words that are similar sounding or have some sort of sonic connection. And then as I'm warming up more, there will be more distance between those words that have stronger sonic connections. It's like if I'm swinging from word to word at the start, there are lots of small, quick swings,
mm,
and as I get more comfortable and and more meaning arrives to the work, the swings take a longer time between one another, but the swing is still felt.
yeah.
As an example, if I were to start with the word conundrum,
Mhm,
I might associate that word in 3 different ways. I could go with drum, and the next word would be like drumstick.
mm,
I could go with none, and the next word is nunchuck or, literally just None, none.
yeah.
Or I could go with con, right? And the next word is convict. And just going and going, conundrum, convict, Victoria, or Orpheus, right? Just like swinging from word to word. It helps me because it opens up my language for one. Whenever I do this, I am encountering words that I know they are in my body, they're in my head, but I have not pulled them out as often in everyday conversation or maybe even in my writing recently. And that association reminds me that I have a much wider and more varied vocabulary to pull from my poems, which is huge because there are sometimes when I'm looking at a page and I'm like, man, I only know 30 words. It's
Which is
that's
crazy
it.
because you are one of the most well versed niggas that I know.
Thank you. I like being a verse nigga, so I appreciate that.
That's great. Because I was going to ask you because we were talking about hip hop and thinking about the joys of clever wordplay, and I was going to ask you how do you find the wordplay and the sonic association guiding the work? So that's really great. And any exercises that you had doing it. But I love that, and that's probably something I could do more. Like I try to lean on sound. Like I love a good alliteration to guide the rhythm of the work. When I see it in your poems, I think I'm always really struck by the clever, like, sonic freedom of the work. It can maybe be a little bit contradicting, like that tight association does create some sort of like sonic freedom. Like I feel free saying it because the words are coming so naturally in my mouth. But I am thinking of your birthday sonnets. And for anyone who's listening and is not already familiar with Tariq's work, Tariq shares a birthday with 20 incredible people, and then his parents also share birthdays with incredible people. I was recently just teaching your poem on their birthday. My daddy and Suge Knight discussed forgiveness and the interesting ways that one as quote unquote after poems, which I define as really most poems of direct inspiration, it does not tell us who specifically the speaker is, or rather, there is a melding of voices between your daddy and Suge Knight, or in your other poems like you and Lorraine Hansberry. And just thinking about the way not only that there's two voices now layering on top of each other, but also even the way that the rhythm and that sonic association is maintained even when you're using the words from maybe a specific kind of,
Maybe vernacular or
yeah, that's exactly the word I'm
Mhm,
looking for, a specific kind of
mhm,
vernacular. And
mhm.
I'm sure there's something you're considering there because you're very thoughtful about the play between those. But I think maybe if I was to phrase this as a question, when you're going about those poems specifically, where you're thinking about the vernaculars of other folks and how
Mhm.
they live, how does that factor into those sonic considerations?
Yeah, and thank you for the attentiveness to the work. I really appreciate it. I would say everyone has their own natural rhythm, and if you are attentive to other folks and you listen to how they speak or how they're writing, it becomes more apparent. I want to shout out Tangi Mitchell. We were at a bookstore recently, um, and she was telling this story about her mom and her grandma, and she switched into this impersonation of them because she was like talking about a conversation that they were having. And I was just so struck by the specificity and clarity in her, like, imitating them.
Mm.
I was like, "You love them so deep and you know them so well that their words, their sound, their rhythms can come out of your mouth and it feels true." Like, I was floored, and it's apparent in her work too.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
And so many black women poets specifically, the way that lives in, like,
mhm,
I talk about Ramika Bingham Risher all the time, but and I will continue
mhm,
to, honestly, I'm not even sorry about it. But just thinking about the way that the words in Room Swept Home lives, I'm thinking about Nicole Seeley, who only does certain, she doesn't do as much kind of direct quotation, but thinking about when she talks about her mother or things like that, the way that the words live in her body, what being known by someone does to the work, the reception of the work. Like I can see when someone has paid deep attention to a thing or has deep
mhm,
care for a thing, and that charges the attention to the work. Not a black woman, but Keith S. Wilson has one of
mhm,
my favorite poems in defense of pigeons.
mhm,
and
yes,
and it just once again like the kind of attention that is given to a thing and the way that changes the energy of the poem, it changes the sound of a poem. I'd also think like the rhythm and wordplay, I think maybe not directly or consciously, but there's a subconscious like euphony that happens. Like it's really pleasing to
mm,
us, and something about the way that it's pleasing goes back to that sense of attention. You cared about this thing enough to give it proper form and
mm,
proper like weight in the air. I want to go back to the essay you mentioned earlier about from Carl Phillips. And so, for those who haven't read the essay, it's called Muscularity and Eros on Syntax by Carl Phillips. And in the essay, Phillips talks about the patterning of language that makes a poem, saying that the poem is, quote, a bodily thing, end quote. And that, like our bodies, it moves as a result of unseen mechanisms. So just as the body moves from joints and tendons, the poem moves with voltas and end jams and rhymes. And so I'm wondering for you, Tariq, how does poetry become an embodied thing for you? And how do you find yourself in patterning language?
Mhm. Thank you. I love this essay so much. I think it's one of my favorite essays on poetry. It really has informed the way that I think about my work and the works of others. Once you start considering poems as bodies and start looking for those tendons and joints and those patterns, especially, it opens up so much. I just want to say I really invite folks to use color if they can. We've been in class together,
Yeah,
so
yeah,
you've seen
yeah.
this a bit, but I love to take a bunch of highlighters and make up my own key for myself. If I see a particular image popping up a bunch or a particular sound or even a kind of sound like harsh sounds versus softer sounds or sounds that require this certain movement of the mouth versus this other one, thinking about poems as bodies and how that relates to my own work and my own process. And um, I actually, what I just referenced is the way that a poem or a line feels in the mouth, I think is something that I'm thinking about often, whether I'm in revision or I'm in workshop with someone, or even if I'm just at a reading and something really moves me and I'm like rolling it over in my mind and in my mouth. As an example, or like kind of two examples, there's a Suge Knight poem that you mentioned earlier. I was reflecting on this because every time I read this poem, there's a particular moment that always almost makes me buckle.
Mm,
And when I was younger, I didn't think about why as much. Like I thought about it in terms of meaning, but I didn't think about it in terms of the mechanics of it as much.
yeah.
But the moment in the poem, the line is, I caved and loved him. I left.
Mm,
Um, and the reason that I think that moves me is because we have the V sound, loved, and then we get left.
yeah.
And it's like a similar movement, but it's so much softer.
Right.
And so that breaking of that pattern, I think, is what creates the energy or the heat in that moment. And then talking again about Charisma, who is incredible, there's a poem in her debut titled What's It Like Escaping Something Trying to Kill You?
Mm,
And the final line is such sororal horror. And that's a line that like just like lives in my head rent free. And in thinking about it, I think it's also about the way that the mouth moves. Because when you say it, your like lips and teeth only meet at the very beginning.
mm,
Such sororal horror. So that's
mm,
right? But the rest of that line, oral horror, such sororal horror, like your mouth is just open. That sound around.
yeah.
And it's haunting. You feel like a bit disturbed, but also intrigued. And it's masterful. So I think about things like that in terms of the tendons and the joints. And then there are two other things I was thinking about. Carl Phillips himself, Mr. Syntax.
Yeah.
There was an exercise that you and I both had to do in Monica Yoon's class. I think it was our like a year or two ago.
Yeah.
We had to write a poem that was just one long sentence that
Yes.
had we write a lot of twists and turns. I think the poem we were reading was like Wherefore Less Lonely. And when we were first given that assignment, I was like, I don't know how I'm supposed to get anywhere near what this man does with syntax and like the twists and turns and
Mm,
the surprises. So what I ended up doing, I sat in the library and I think I had like a piece of a sentence that I wanted to play around with. And I just wrote it over and over. I would write it on one line and I would write it again and another part of the sentence would come to me. I would write it again and I'd realize that comma I put there actually needed to be an M dash or maybe a colon. And
mhm.
I I'll write it again. And I think I wrote through a third of my moleskin, just like in that one sentence that kept growing and the turns kept changing. Um, it felt like true to what Carl Phillips was talking about in the essay. Like literally my hands were writing this poem over and over, and I could feel when something needed a tweak or where something was catching in just the wrong way. I think that's an example of where the poem is also living in other parts of the body, right? Not just the mouth. Um, I think sometimes too, I can get stuck, right? Even though I like to be led by sound, sometimes I can get stuck in the same place. And so, speaking of the Grace Jones sonnet, that poem, I had done all the emotional research, right? I'd watched all the interviews, taken all my notes, listened to all the songs. Like I felt the feeling was there. I knew what I wanted to say. Not exactly, but like in terms of direction, right?
Yeah.
But the music was not there, which felt really ironic. 'Cause I was like, oh wow, of course.
for Grace
Now
Jones,
it's
yeah.
so what I did, Terrence Hayes is like one of the biggest influences on my work, specifically American Sonnets from My Past and Future Assassins. To get out of that rut, I sat down at my desk, which is actually literally where you are sitting right now. And I read American Sonnets cover to cover out loud in one sitting. I went through each poem, and once I got to the end, I put it down, and then I wrote. And because those poems were just like dancing in my body for, I think it took me like an hour and a half to read the entire thing, I could hear everything.
Yeah.
And I wrote that poem in one sitting.
Damn.
Which does not happen very often, but I was really shocked by like how helpful it was to just read aloud for an extended period of time and what that could unlock. So the last thing I guess I'll say about this is I'm also a syllable counter, and not to the point that I'm like a master of iambic pentameter. I still very much struggle with that actually.
Yeah.
But I think a part of the rhythm or thinking about how a poem comes out of the mouth is if it feels like too much is trying to get out at once. So as I'm writing the sonnets or any of the other poems, I'll just like count. And with the sonnets in particular, nowadays, I have a stricter approach to it where if you look at the later ones like Grace Jones, or there's a forthcoming one with Kevin Garnett,
Great.
you'll see that for the most part, the lines are about like 9 to 12 syllables. But in the earlier poems, especially Malcolm X has a fat ass. Both, that's not a sentence I thought I would say. That poem, you know what? He probably did too. He was fine.
It was, yep.
But that poem gets so big towards the end. You can tell that I was a younger poet that had a lot to say. And I don't think that having a lot to say or it growing towards the end is a bad thing necessarily. It's more acknowledging the difference of what being more attentive to the syllables affords me. I think by the beginning of that poem, it sticks to that 9 to 12-ish. But by the end of the poem, it's 16, 17 syllables, and you can hear it. And so if I were to read that poem and then immediately follow up with Grace Jones or Kevin Garnett, the tightness and the specificity and the surety in those later poems, I think is much more apparent because the sound is being attended to more closely.
Yeah.
It's a tighter dance.
Yeah. I recently wrote my own birthday sonnet thinking about yours, and I had a similar issue where I was writing it and I realized my sonnet was becoming unwieldy. I looked back at your sonnets and I realized how tight those, or how tight's not the right word, or maybe it is. The syllable count was consistent. There was a consistent length of that breath. And me realizing, oh, the reason why this sonnet feels like it's doing too much is because it is doing too much. Like it's too much language at once. And I have to allow the lines of the sonnet to breathe a little bit more. And so then I went back and I edited it, and I was like, okay, this is a better Thompsonian sonnet. I mean, we could talk about your work all day and the very clear attention you give to work. And dear listeners, if you ever have a chance to see it in action, Tariq does the most incredible close reads. Always was a joy to have you present in class in the middle of some other fuck ass presentations. It was because it was always so clear. I was talking with, and this is no shade to anyone in our MFA program, but I was talking with someone earlier about like the rigor that is or isn't required of us sometimes in the classrooms. And maybe that's at other MFAs too. Just like, what is the MFA actually asking of us? And what I really appreciate about you as a peer is that you always brought your own rigor. Like the bar was low. Some people limboed but beneath that bar. And you always set the bar so much higher. And I think it inspired a better poetic landscape in the classroom. It made me like just want niggas to like really read the stuff that they were reading and to give it the proper attention it deserved, because you showed us that any poem, there's something to excavate from them. And yeah, there's always something to be gained listening, especially from you talk about a poem and your close reads. But with that, I think I will thank you for your time, Tariq. It's been so wonderful having this conversation with you.
Like that.
And I would love if you could close us out by reading your own work that showcases prosody.
Absolutely. You look just like the bastard. My daddy, all honey and heartthrob, smooth rain slid slick down panes of glass. My daddy bladed shade, all wicked glint and stride. My daddy pleads and weathers. My daddy a rage of absence, air viscous, all cuss words and steel. My daddy myth and muster. My daddy Mr. Silence. My daddy miss suppers. My daddy's silos and silos of loss. My daddy real, all moonscape and scar. My daddy's freckled badness, his saccharine base. So, my strawberry nose.
Thank you all for listening to this episode of the O Word podcast produced by me, D. Sol Carson. If you are interested in this topic, I've added some folks recommended by our guests in the Substack posts. The music for O Word is provided by Esoteric Creations. Check them out on Spotify. Our guest Tariq offers the following prompts. Write a poem that uses disruptive punctuation, like in Kava Akbar's Pilgrim Bell, or write a poem that meditates on a letter by overusing alliteration, like in Sam Sachs' Lisp. Both example poems can be found in the episode transcript. Until next time, thanks for listening.